It all begins with a single, grainy clip. No warning, no context, just a flash of chaos that would soon explode into a worldwide firestorm. A hand raised, a face turned away in shock, and then silence. What would you do if you saw the unthinkable unfold? Not behind palace walls, not hidden in some secret chamber of the elite, but right there, in broad daylight, at the gates of one of the most luxurious estates in the world. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The footage, barely 30 seconds long, has ignited questions so uncomfortable, so disturbing, that even those closest to the couple don't dare answer them aloud. Questions that pierce through the polished image of wealth and glamour, slicing into the very heart of what it means to appear perfect on the outside while crumbling within. Because for years, the narrative was carefully managed. The powerful man and his captivating wife, a modern fairy tale written in designer ink. They were adored, envied, dissected, every smile analyzed, every gesture magnified. And yet, beneath the glittering surface, something darker was stirring, something no one was supposed to see. But now we have seen it. The tape has surfaced, and whether it was leaked, planted, or stolen, one fact cannot be denied. It changes everything. Pause for a moment. Think about the last time you believed a story without question. Think about the trust you placed in it. That's what makes this moment so devastating. We aren't just witnessing a fight. We're witnessing the collapse of an illusion. And here's the haunting truth. Once you've seen behind the curtain, you can't unsee it. The first seconds of the footage show them walking side by side. At first, everything looks normal, almost boring. He carries himself with that familiar blend of pride and weariness, while she, sharp-eyed and quick-footed, seems restless, as though the very air around her isn't fast enough. Then, without warning, the shift. Her expression hardens. Her hand snaps up. His body recoils. Freeze frame that instant in your mind. That single moment when admiration curdles into confusion. When love twists into violence. When the carefully curated image begins to crack. But what led to this? How does a couple, once hailed as the modern face of romance, reach the point where the mask falls away in the most brutal fashion imaginable? That is the story we're about to unravel. We're not just talking about gossip. This isn't tabloid filler or a harmless internet rumor. This is something far more raw, far more dangerous. The exposure of a hidden truth that forces us to question everything we thought we knew about power, control, and the fragile line between devotion and destruction. And here's where it gets even stranger. The footage is messy, incomplete, just enough to shock, but not enough to explain. That gap, that mystery, is exactly what keeps people glued to their screens. Because when something doesn't make sense, when we're left dangling between what we see and what we think we know, the mind refuses to let go. Is the tape authentic? Was it staged? Could it have been manipulated? Every possibility carries consequences, each more unsettling than the last. But here's the part no one is saying out loud. If it is real, then everything changes. Not just for them, but for us, the audience, the consumers, the believers of their story. Because suddenly the roles are reversed. The victim is not who we thought. The aggressor is not who we imagined. And the fairy tale becomes a tragedy, live-streamed for the world. You might be asking yourself, why does this matter? Why should a 30-second clip of a fight between two people, who don't know us, people who will never meet us, command such attention? The answer is simple. Because we made them larger than life. We turned them into symbols. And symbols cannot break without shaking the foundations they stand on. When we see cracks in their world, we start to notice cracks in our own. And that is what makes this story impossible to look away from. For years, critics whispered. For years, admirers defended. But now, with this one explosive piece of evidence, those whispers turn into screams. And the world is left wondering, what really happens behind those mansion walls? Some argue it was just a heated moment. Others say it was proof of something far more sinister. A pattern, a secret life of conflict hidden beneath the manicured gardens and golden gates. Whatever the truth, the footage has forced us into the role of witness. And once you are a witness, you cannot claim ignorance. And let me ask you this. If this is what happens when the cameras aren't supposed to be rolling, then what else don't we know? The footage ends abruptly, as if cut off by design. No resolution. No explanation. just a dangling cliff that leaves the imagination to fill in the blanks. And those blanks, those shadows between the frames, are where the most haunting possibilities live. Imagine him, alone afterward, his expression blank but his body marked. Imagine her, storming away, no regret, no glance back. Or maybe, just maybe, imagine them reconciling behind closed doors, rehearsing their next public smile, determined to keep the illusion alive at all costs. The truth could be any of these. The truth could be none of them. And that is what makes this story a riddle wrapped in heartbreak. What we know for certain is this. Once the footage leaked, silence was no longer an option. Their world, once impenetrable, is now under siege from speculation, outrage, and disbelief. Every detail, every second, dissected under the microscope of public judgment. And the timing? Perfectly cruel. Released when their popularity was already under strain, when old allies had turned distant, when even their fiercest supporters had begun to waver. It wasn't just a leak, it was a strike at the very moment they were weakest. Coincidence? Or calculated? And yet, for all the theories, all the noise, the one thing no one can shake is that haunting image burned into memory. The hand raised, the face recoiling. The moment that shattered the illusion. As we dive deeper, we will unravel the buildup that led to this explosive moment. The warning signs ignored, the contradictions buried, the pressures that mounted like a storm no one dared acknowledge. We will explore the public narrative versus the private reality, the myth versus the man, the image versus the truth. And every step of the way, we will confront the uncomfortable question. How well do we really know the people we idolize? This is more than scandal. This is revelation. And revelations, once exposed, cannot be undone. So take a breath, because what comes next will not be easy to hear. We're about to step behind the gates. We're about to strip away the layers of performance and pretense. And we're about to see what happens when the mask slips, when the curtain falls, when the truth refuses to stay hidden. But fair warning, the deeper we go, the darker it gets. And if you think this first glimpse was shocking, wait until you hear what came next. Because that, no one saw coming. It all seemed perfect at first. That's how every story like this begins, doesn't it? A man with a title, a fortune, a reputation so polished it gleamed under the relentless spotlight. A woman with charm, charisma, and the kind of presence that turned heads before she even entered the room. Together, they looked untouchable. But perfection is a dangerous illusion. And illusions don't last forever. Let's rewind. Before the footage, before the leaks, before the whispers turned into screams, there was only the story we were told. The grand narrative of romance and reinvention. The headlines painted them as modern royalty, progressive, glamorous, liberated from tradition, but still basking in its aura. They were the couple who would redefine what power looked like. And for a while, we believed it. Didn't you? Look back at those first photos, those carefully staged interviews. He always appeared slightly shy, almost awkward, but she lit up the screen with effortless confidence. That dynamic worked beautifully at first, the quiet protector and the radiant star. Together, they embodied balance. But here's where it gets interesting. That same dynamic, protector and star, can, under pressure, twist into something darker. The protector becomes the controlled. The star becomes the storm. And if you look closely, really closely, you'll see that the warning signs were there from the beginning. Think about their public appearances. Notice how often she led the conversation while he hovered quietly. Think about the way he deferred to her, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with nervous laughter. Admirers called it progressive. Finally, a man strong enough to stand behind a powerful woman. But critics whispered, was it admiration or was it submission? Let me ask you, how do you tell the difference? The truth is, you can't. Not from the outside. And that's the point. They wanted you to see what they wanted you to see. But behind the glitter, there were cracks. Small, almost invisible at first. A clipped response during an interview. A frozen smile when the cameras lingered too long. A gesture of irritation mistaken for passion. You know what it's like, don't you? To be around a couple who seems perfect, but something about the way they glance at each other, too sharp, too fast, makes you wonder. Something unsaid hangs in the air, and you can't quite put your finger on it. That's what this was like. Now, fast forward to the months leading up to the infamous footage. Stress was mounting. Their popularity was slipping. Financial pressures, estranged relationships, relentless media criticism, all of it pressing down like weights on fragile glass. When glass is under pressure, even the smallest crack can spread until the entire structure shatters. And that's exactly what happened. According to people close to them, insiders who only spoke under anonymity, their arguments had become more frequent, more heated. What started as subtle tension in public blossomed into full-blown conflict in private. He wanted peace, quiet, stability. She wanted more attention, more influence, more validation. Their goals, once aligned, were pulling them apart. And yet, they continued to perform for us. Smiles at charity galas, tender handholds during interviews. The illusion held, at least on the surface. But the more they clung to it, the more unstable it became. Do you see the irony? The very image they worked so hard to protect became the prison that trapped them. The more perfect they tried to appear, the more impossible it was to admit imperfection. And imperfection, denied for too long, turns into poison. Here's where the contradiction hits hardest. He, once celebrated as a symbol of resilience, found himself shrinking in her shadow. And she, once celebrated as a beacon of independence, seemed to grow sharper, more restless, more demanding. Together, their strengths turned against them. Now, imagine this. The couple standing on the manicured lawn of their mansion. The sun is too bright, the air too still. Words are exchanged, sharp, hurried, impossible to soften. A hand flies up, a body flinches, and suddenly, the illusion is gone. That was the footage. But the footage was only the symptom. The disease had been spreading for years. And here's the chilling thought. How many times had it happened before the camera caught it? How many moments of tension, of rage, of silence, had been swept under the velvet rug of appearances? This is why the clip matters. Because it wasn't just one fight. It was the eruption of a volcano that had been rumbling for years, ignored because no one dared admit the ground was shaking. Think about your own life for a moment. How many times have you ignored the cracks in a relationship, convinced yourself things were fine, told yourself the story you needed to believe? That's why this scandal resonates. It isn't just about them, it's about us. About the lies we all tell to protect the fairy tales we're too afraid to lose. The public wanted a modern love story. The media wanted headlines. The couple wanted control. But reality? Reality doesn't bend to desire. It breaks through, violent and unforgiving, the moment you least expect it. And when it did, the world gasped. Because deep down, people weren't just shocked, they were betrayed. Betrayed by the idea that love could sour, that power could corrupt, that beauty could hide something so ugly. But here's the kicker. The betrayal wasn't only emotional. It was financial, political, cultural. Their brand, built on perfection, was currency. And once that brand cracked, so did everything tied to it. Sponsors, deals, partnerships, invitations. Reputation is fragile, and in the world of the elite, once it's stained, it's almost impossible to wash clean. So the footage wasn't just a scandal. It was a detonation. Now pause with me. Take a breath. Picture the couple inside that mansion after the clip ended. Doors slammed shut, curtains drawn, silence settling over the chaos. Outside, the world is already buzzing. Online forums ignite. Newsrooms scramble. Phones ring. But inside, only two people know the truth of what really happened. And here's the haunting part. They aren't telling. Not yet. Which brings us to the question no one can escape. What's next? If this was the first eruption, what comes after? Do they repair the cracks? Or does the whole structure collapse? That's what Chapter 2 will uncover. Because if you think this was the breaking point, you're wrong. The real explosion was still to come. How does something so private, so damning, make its way into the public eye? That's the question that burned hotter than the footage itself. Because make no mistake, the fight was shocking, but the leak was the real bombshell. Let's face it, mansions like theirs don't just sprout cameras by accident. Security is airtight, monitored, controlled. Every gate locked. Every pathway watched. For years, their home had been described as a fortress, designed to keep intruders out and secrets in. So who opened the gates? Theories exploded within hours. Some claimed a nosy neighbor caught the scene from afar, their phone trembling as they recorded through the hedges. Others swore it was a disgruntled staff member, Someone who had seen too much and finally decided to reveal the truth. And the darkest theory of all, that the footage came from inside, leaked deliberately, by someone close enough to know exactly when to press record. Think about that for a moment. If it's true, then this wasn't just exposure. It was betrayal. And betrayal, as we'll see, is the fuel that makes scandals burn hotter than fire. But before we dive into the suspects, let's pause. Because there's something eerie about the way the clip first appeared. No build-up, no warning. Just a sudden drop on an anonymous online account. No watermark. No attempt to sell it to a tabloid. Just raw, unfiltered chaos uploaded for the world to devour. That anonymity was intentional. It created mystery. And mystery feeds obsession. Within minutes, the video was ripped, shared, reposted across platforms. Algorithms pushed it higher. Headlines erupted like fireworks. Suddenly, the couple's fortress wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was the most dissected stage on Earth. And here's where it gets worse. Once the video escaped, there was no pulling it back. You know how the internet works. Once something's out, it's everywhere, living in screenshots, re-uploads, mirrors. Even if you delete it, it's too late. The image is burned into memory, impossible to erase. But let's return to the question. Who leaked it? Some point to staff, the drivers, the assistants, the gardeners. People often invisible in the background of luxury, yet always within earshot. Could resentment have boiled over? Maybe someone who felt underpaid, overlooked, mistreated? Secrets are dangerous in the hands of the underappreciated. Others suggest a coordinated strike, a rival faction, a bitter relative, a business enemy. In the world of power and influence, every scandal has its beneficiaries, who stood to gain from their downfall. Follow the trail of profit, and you might find the hand that pressed upload. And then there's the possibility no one wants to voice. What if it wasn't betrayal at all, but strategy? What if the leak came from within their own circle, even from one of them? A twisted attempt to control the narrative by detonating it themselves. If they knew the story would break eventually, why not own the timing? Why not weaponize the scandal before it could be weaponized against them? Think about that. Because if true, it means this wasn't exposure. It was manipulation. And that makes the story even darker. Now, let's not forget the human side. Imagine waking up one morning to find the most vulnerable, humiliating moment of your life looping endlessly across the globe. Imagine refreshing your phone only to see strangers debating your relationship, dissecting your gestures, inventing theories about your pain. For him, the man in the footage, the shock must have been suffocating. The world suddenly saw him not as the confident figure he'd built himself into, but as the victim, and being seen as weak, exposed, helpless, that must have cut deeper than any wound on his skin. For her, the woman in the footage, the fallout was immediate and brutal. Overnight, she was cast as the villain, the aggressor. The narrative flipped with merciless speed. Once adored, now condemned. Once envied, now despised. How does someone recover when their entire identity collapses in a single viral moment? The truth is, they both lost. But the world didn't care. The public wasn't mourning, they were feasting. Because scandal is addictive. It pulls us in, makes us click, makes us judge. And the bigger the fall, the louder the applause. Why do we do this? Why do we watch? Maybe it's schadenfreude, joy at someone else's misfortune. Maybe it's relief, proof that even the untouchable can bleed. Or maybe it's just curiosity, that insatiable hunger to peek behind the curtain, even when what we see disgusts us. The couple knew this truth, perhaps better than anyone. They had built their empire on attention. They had courted cameras, cultivated images, turned their love story into currency. And now, that same attention was devouring them alive. You could almost call it poetic. But don't mistake poetry for justice. There was nothing fair about the leak. It was intrusion, exposure, violation. No matter how you feel about them, no one deserves to have their most intimate horrors broadcast to the world. And yet, here we are, watching, rewatching, judging, sharing, because we can't look away. Here's the twist. The footage might not even be the full story. The angle was limited, the audio garbled, details blurred, interpretations twisted. Did we really see what we think we saw? Or were we seeing what we wanted to see? That's the paradox of scandal. It tells us everything and nothing at once. It gives us just enough to ignite outrage, but never enough to settle it. And the couple, locked behind their mansion doors, had to decide, stay silent and let the world define the story, or fight back and risk making it worse. History shows us that silence is rarely protection. Silence is fuel. Silence makes people assume the worst. But speaking up? That's a gamble too. Because once you open your mouth, every word is a weapon, one that can backfire in an instant. So what did they do? They waited. Days passed. The world grew louder. Analysts, commentators, former friends, everyone had an opinion. Was he safe? Was she unstable? Was their relationship doomed? Every headline shouted louder than the last. And then, finally, the silence broke. But what they said shocked even their most loyal defenders. Because instead of denying, instead of apologizing, instead of explaining, they did something no one expected. And that decision would turn a scandal into a war. When the silence finally broke, it wasn't with a whisper. It was with a roar. The world leaned in, holding its breath. What would they say? How could they possibly spin 30 seconds of chaos that had already been replayed millions of times? Would they admit fault, plead for privacy, or try to bury the story beneath polished statements and legal jargon? No one was prepared for what actually came. Their response was not denial. It was not apology. It was defiance. Standing side by side in a carefully staged setting, elegant but understated, framed by soft lighting and neutral tones, they delivered a joint statement that set the internet ablaze all over again. He spoke first, voice steady but eyes shadowed. She followed, tone firm, almost daring. And together, they painted a picture that twisted the narrative on its head. "We are not perfect," he began, his words deliberate, each syllable heavy. "No marriage is. No partnership is. What you saw was a moment, taken out of context, weaponized against us." She leaned in, her gaze sharp, unwavering. "Our privacy has been violated. Our lives dissected without consent. And now, the world believes it can define us based on one stolen moment. But let us be clear. We refuse to be defined by lies, by manipulation, by those who seek to destroy what we have built." The message was simple, yet explosive. The footage wasn't the truth. It was a distortion, a smear, a trap. And just like that, the scandal wasn't just about a fight anymore. It was about war over truth, over perception, over who controls the story. But let's pause here. Because their strategy was bold, and boldness always comes with risk. On the one hand, defiance can inspire loyalty. It can turn supporters into warriors, rallying behind a cause greater than the scandal itself. On the other, defiance can inflame critics, confirming every suspicion, every doubt. In a fight for narrative control, every word is a double-edged sword. Ask yourself, if you saw that statement, would you believe it? Or would you see it as desperate spin, a desperate attempt to rewrite reality? The public was divided. Some applauded their strength, their refusal to bow under pressure. Others scoffed, convinced the couple was gaslighting the world. The footage was undeniable, they argued. No words could erase what had been seen. And so the battlefield expanded. The media dissected every gesture of the statement. Analysts slowed down their body language, interpreting eye contact, micro-expressions, posture. Was his voice too shaky? Was her tone too sharp? Did his hand twitch in fear or in frustration? Suddenly, even their attempt at unity became fuel for speculation. And yet, buried beneath the words, there was something more telling. The subtle imbalance of power. He spoke softly, cautiously, as though weighing every word. She, on the other hand, carried the performance, firm, controlled, unyielding. To some, it was strength. To others, dominance. This contrast ignited an even more dangerous debate. Who was really in control of this marriage? Who held the power, and who bore the weight? The irony? Their statement, designed to silence speculation, only fed it. But let's go deeper. Because what they didn't say spoke louder than what they did. They didn't deny the altercation happened. They didn't apologize to each other, to their families, or to the public. Instead, they reframed it, not as a personal failing, but as a collective attack. That's not an accident. That's strategy. By making themselves the victims of intrusion, they shifted focus from their fight to the leak itself. By crying foul over privacy, they attempted to transform humiliation into sympathy. And by hinting at manipulation, they planted seeds of doubt. Maybe the footage was edited. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe, just maybe, we were the villains for watching it. Clever, isn't it? But cleverness doesn't guarantee success. Because once you invite the world to question the truth, you can't control where that questioning leads. And the questions kept coming. If it wasn't what it looked like, then what was it? If it wasn't violence, then what was the flinch? If it wasn't humiliation, then why did his face look so wounded? Every denial, every deflection, only made people hungrier for answers. And here's the twist. Their enemies seized the moment. Old critics resurfaced, louder than ever. Former friends whispered to journalists. Distant relatives offered cryptic comments. Suddenly, the couple wasn't just fighting against a video. They were fighting against an army of voices eager to tear them down. This is the paradox of power. The higher you climb, the more vultures circle when you stumble. And stumble, they had. But before you pity them, consider this. Weren't they the ones who courted the spotlight? Who traded privacy for influence, anonymity for celebrity? When you build an empire on attention, can you really complain when that attention turns against you? This is why their statement sparked not just sympathy and criticism, but outrage. Because for many, it felt hypocritical. And yet, there was something undeniably human about it. Two people, standing together against a storm, insisting on their version of truth even as the tides swept against them. Whether you believe them or not, you couldn't look away. But here's the part that few noticed at first, a subtle moment buried in the performance. As she spoke, fierce and unyielding, his eyes drifted downward. His shoulders slumped ever so slightly. For a brief second, just a flicker, the mask cracked. What did that mean? Exhaustion? Resignation? Or something far more chilling? Silent agreement with the footage, even as his words denied it? That fleeting image became its own kind of evidence. Screenshots spread. Commentators froze the frame. Look at him, they said. He's not fighting for her. He's surviving her. Was it true? Maybe. Maybe not. But in the court of public opinion, perception is everything. And perception had already shifted. Their statement, intended as a shield, became another weapon against them. Instead of calming the storm, it fed the fire. Instead of closing the chapter, it opened a new one. A chapter where allies would choose sides, enemies would grow bold, and the truth would become harder to untangle than ever. Because here's the reality. Once doubt is planted, it grows wild. Once the curtain is pulled back, you can't draw it closed again. And this was just the beginning. Because after the statement, after the defiance, after the world had debated every syllable, a new leak emerged. And this one would make the first video look tame. The first video cracked the illusion. The statement tried to patch it. But the second leak? The second leak shattered everything beyond repair. It dropped without warning, like a thunderclap on a cloudless day. No build-up, no cryptic teasers, just a sudden appearance online, uploaded by yet another anonymous account. The timing was cruelly precise. Less than a week after their joint statement, just when the storm was beginning to settle. The world hadn't even finished debating the first tape, and now a new one was burning through the internet like wildfire. This time, the footage was longer, sharper, more damning. And unlike the grainy, fragmented first clip, this one offered sound. Imagine the scene. A grand hallway inside the mansion, marble floors gleaming under chandeliers. Their voices echoing, sharp with tension. He pleads, voice cracking. She snaps back, words like knives. Then, the moment. Not a blurred gesture, not a questionable angle. A clear strike. A gasp. Silence heavy as stone. For the first time, the world didn't just see. It heard. The reaction was instant, explosive. If the first leak planted doubt, the second one buried it. Supporters who once defended them fell silent. Journalists who hesitated to choose sides now sharpened their pens. Commentators called it confirmation. Proof. Evidence of a truth no statement could erase. And yet, questions lingered. Who was filming inside the mansion? How had two separate leaks surfaced in less than 2 weeks? Why now? Why these clips, and why in this order? Coincidence doesn't explain precision. This wasn't random. This was orchestrated. But orchestrated by whom? Some pointed to enemies outside the gates. Old rivals, corporate adversaries, people with the resources and connections to penetrate even the most guarded estate. Others suggested something darker, more intimate, betrayal from within. A friend, a confidant, a A staff member trusted too much. But here's the theory that turned the internet upside down. What if one of them leaked it? Think about that for a second. If the first leak created doubt and the second destroyed it, who benefited? Was it him, casting himself as the victim at last? Or was it her, daring the world to judge her, only to reframe herself as the misunderstood villain, a role that, in its own twisted way, still commands power? Conspiracy theories multiplied like wildfire. The more shocking the claim, the more people shared it. Some believed the leaks were part of a grand scheme to distract from financial troubles. Others claimed the videos were staged, part of an elaborate publicity stunt. After all, in a world addicted to attention, even negative attention is currency. But here's the problem. The second leak didn't feel staged. It felt raw, painful, real. His voice trembled with desperation. Hers cut through the air like glass. There was no glamour, no polish, no script. Just human beings unraveling under pressure. And the public, once entertained, now felt something deeper, unease. Because this wasn't just scandal anymore. This was abuse. This was trauma. This was the kind of darkness most people prefer to pretend doesn't exist. Watching it felt wrong, invasive, and yet, no one could turn away. That's the paradox of scandal, isn't it? We condemn it while consuming it. We call it vile while clicking play again. The second leak didn't just change the narrative. It changed the stakes. Now, questions of morality loomed. Should the public even be watching? Should news outlets broadcast it? Was it exploitation to dissect every frame? Or was it necessary to confront uncomfortable truths? The debate spiraled, but one fact became undeniable. The couple was no longer a symbol of glamour or modern love. They were a symbol of something darker. The fragility of power, the poison of control, the ugliness that festers behind closed doors. And here's where things get even more twisted. With the release of the second leak, pressure mounted for an official investigation. Not just from the media, but from authorities. Calls for intervention grew louder. Was he safe? Did she cross a line into criminal behavior? Could money, fame, influence still shield them from accountability? For the first time, the fortress wasn't just cracked, it was vulnerable. And imagine what that felt like inside the mansion. Every phone call, every knock on the door, every unfamiliar car parked nearby must have sparked paranoia. Who could they trust? Who had betrayed them? Who was watching, listening, recording? The home that was supposed to be their sanctuary had become a cage of glass. But let's step back. Why was the second leak more devastating than the first? Because it left no room for denial. The first could be spun, grainy, partial, lacking sound. The second stripped away plausible deniability. It was raw evidence. And evidence demands action. Supporters who once clung to hope now turned away. Sponsors reevaluated contracts. Invitations were rescinded. The couple's carefully curated empire began to crumble, brick by brick. And yet, they did not retreat quietly. Instead, they doubled down. Another statement, this time sharper, angrier. She denounced the leaks as illegal intrusions, called them doctored fabrications. He, visibly shaken, echoed her words, though his voice lacked conviction. But here's the question you have to ask yourself. If the footage was fake, why did it look so real? If it was fabricated, why did it align perfectly with whispers that had been circling for years? The world didn't buy it. Not this time. And that's the cruel truth about reputation. Once trust is broken, every denial sounds like a lie. The second leak didn't just damage their image, it erased it. They weren't the power couple anymore. They weren't the aspirational fairy tale. They were a cautionary tale, unraveling in real time. But before you think the story ends here, let me tell you something chilling. The second leak was not the final blow. Because as devastating as it was, there was still more hidden in the shadows. More footage, more whispers, more betrayals waiting to surface. And the third leak? The third leak would make the world question not just the couple, but itself. By the time the third leak surfaced, people thought they had already seen it all. The first clip cracked the illusion. The second clip obliterated the defense. What more could possibly be revealed? The answer, everything. This wasn't just another shaky recording. It wasn't a fragment of audio or a partial glimpse through the curtains. The third leak was a full compilation, hours condensed into minutes. A carefully edited sequence that told a story far darker, far more disturbing than anyone was prepared to face. And here's the terrifying part. Whoever released it knew exactly what they were doing. Because this wasn't chaos. This was narrative. The video opened with calm. Laughter in the kitchen. Drinks poured on a balcony. Smiles exchanged under the glow of chandeliers. Then, the shift. Voices raised. Arguments sharp. Silence stretched too long. The tension built like a drumbeat until finally, inevitably, the eruption. A storm behind gilded doors, caught in chilling detail. For the first time, the world saw not a moment, not a snippet, but a pattern. And patterns change everything. Because a single fight can be dismissed as an accident, a bad day, a mistake, but a series of moments, repeated, escalating, undeniable, that is evidence of a cycle. And cycles cannot be explained away with a press statement. The internet's reaction was volcanic. If the second leak divided opinion, the third obliterated it. Doubt vanished. Sympathy drained. Outrage swelled. For the first time, even their most loyal defenders fell silent, unable to explain what they were watching. Let me ask you, have you ever watched something you wish you could unsee? That pit in your stomach, that sense of crossing a line into knowledge you weren't meant to have? That's what this footage did. It wasn't just scandal anymore. It was trauma, exposed for mass consumption. And yet, people kept watching. Again and again. Because as horrific as it was, the video pulled you in with the same force that makes people slow down at the scene of a car crash. Disgust mixed with fascination. Judgment tangled with pity. The third leak didn't just reveal the collapse of a marriage. It revealed something unsettling about all of us. Why do we watch? Why do we feed on someone else's destruction like it's entertainment? Maybe it's because, deep down, scandal is a mirror. It shows us what we fear could happen in our own lives. The fights behind closed doors, the lies hidden under forced smiles, the truths we don't dare admit out loud. The couple had always been symbols. At first, symbols of love and reinvention. Then, symbols of hypocrisy and scandal. But after the third leak, they became symbols of something much darker. The dangerous intimacy between power, control, and destruction. And once symbols are broken, they can never be put back together again. But let's go deeper. The question no one could answer was this. Who compiled the footage? The first leak felt impulsive, almost sloppy. The second was sharper, but still raw. The third, however, was deliberate, curated, almost cinematic. That level of access meant one of two things. Either someone on the inside had been recording for months, stockpiling evidence until the perfect moment to strike, or one of the couple themselves had orchestrated it, weaponizing their own lives for reasons we can only begin to guess. If it was an insider, it meant betrayal beyond comprehension. Imagine opening your home, your sanctuary, only to realize you'd been living on a stage the whole time, every word and gesture captured by someone you trusted. But if it was one of them, then we're looking at a far darker truth. The possibility that pain itself had been turned into currency. That destruction had become strategy. That one of them had chosen humiliation as a weapon. And here's the part no one wants to say out loud. If that's true, then maybe the story we've been telling isn't about a victim and an aggressor at all. Maybe it's about two people locked in a war, each fighting for control, each willing to burn the other, and themselves, to the ground. Think about that. Because if this was war, then the leaks weren't accidents. They were bombs, dropped with precision. And the third bomb was the deadliest yet. The fallout was immediate. Sponsors fled in droves. Charities severed ties. Networks that once courted them now blacklisted them. Their empire, built over years of careful image management, collapsed in days. But even as their world burned, the couple didn't retreat. No, they escalated. Lawyers were hired. Threats of lawsuits filled the air. Accusations flew, not just at the mysterious leakers, but at each other. The carefully staged unity of their first statement evaporated. Cracks turned into chasms. For the first time, they weren't fighting the world together. They were fighting each other, and the world was watching. And that's the cruelest twist of all. Because what began as a love story, polished for cameras and sold to the masses, had transformed into a gladiator match. Two people once united now tearing each other apart under the harshest spotlight imaginable. The third leak didn't just expose abuse. It exposed war. But here's the thing about wars. They rarely end cleanly. There are always more casualties, more betrayals, more truths clawing their way out of the shadows. And as devastating as the third leak was, Whispers suggested there was still more to come. More footage, more revelations, more bombs waiting to drop. The question wasn't whether the story would escalate. The question was how much darker it could possibly get. And the answer was coming. Because just when the world thought it had seen the worst, something emerged that no one was prepared for. Something not just shocking, but catastrophic. You'd think by now the world would be numb. 3 leaks in as many weeks. 3 bombs dropped with surgical precision, each one more devastating than the last. People told themselves nothing could top it, that the scandal had reached its peak. And then came the catastrophe. This wasn't just another clip. It wasn't a shaky camera in the garden or a recording from behind closed doors. This was different, bigger. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the system that had protected them, profited from them, and turned a blind eye to everything along the way. The leak wasn't a video. It was a file. Thousands of pages. Emails, text exchanges, contracts, security reports. A digital archive ripped from the heart of their empire and dropped into the hands of the world. For the first time, the story wasn't just speculation. It was documented. And what those documents revealed was worse than anyone had imagined. Because this wasn't simply about a toxic relationship. It was about cover-ups. The messages painted a chilling picture. Frantic communications between advisors, desperate attempts to bury scandals before they broke, instructions to silence staff who had seen too much, lawyers scrambling, PR firms drafting false narratives, friends bribed into silence, deals signed with clauses designed not to protect business, but to protect secrets. It was all there in black and white. The illusion of perfection hadn't just been maintained. It had been manufactured. Think about that for a second. Every photo, every smiling interview, every public appearance, all of it choreographed, rehearsed again. And behind every carefully staged moment was a team working overtime to ensure no one saw the truth. Now, imagine what it felt like to open that file, to scroll through page after page of deception. The fights weren't accidents. The cover-ups weren't rare. The machine had been running for years, spinning lies so polished they looked like truth. And the most devastating part? The file suggested the leaks themselves weren't new. They'd been happening internally, quietly, long before the public ever saw them. Suppressed before they could escape. Smothered before they could spread. Until now. The catastrophic revelation wasn't just that the couple was imploding. It was that the world had been complicit, cheering their fairy tale, buying their brand, swallowing their story, while evidence of the opposite had been sitting under lock and key the whole time. And suddenly, the narrative shifted again. This wasn't just a personal scandal. It was systemic. Questions exploded. How many people knew? How high did it go? Were allies, sponsors, institutions aware all along? Did they protect the couple because of love or because of money? The public felt betrayed not just by the couple, but by the entire machine that had fed their story. It wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was corruption, and corruption demands consequences. Protests erupted online. Hashtags trended worldwide. Petitions demanded accountability, not just from the couple, but from everyone who had enabled them. Networks, corporations, charities, all under scrutiny. The file was Pandora's box, and once opened, there was no closing it. But here's what made it catastrophic. It didn't just destroy their image. It destroyed their shield. Until then, they could rely on power, money, connections to soften the blows. But now, no one wanted to be associated with them. Allies turned cold. Friends vanished. Contracts were ripped apart overnight. They weren't just tarnished, they were toxic. And toxicity spreads fast. Inside the mansion, paranoia reached fever pitch. Who leaked the archive? Who had access? Who was feeding the world piece by piece? The couple turned on each other. On staff. On everyone in their circle. Trust evaporated. Every ally looked like a traitor. Every silence sounded like guilt. And the cruelest irony? The more they searched for the leaker, the more isolated they became. Alone, surrounded by walls, but with nowhere to hide. Now pause with me for a moment. Imagine being in their shoes. Imagine watching not just your reputation, but your entire world collapse. Not because of one mistake, but because the truth you buried finally clawed its way to the surface. How would you fight back? Could you fight back? Here's the chilling truth. They tried. Lawyers launched lawsuits against media outlets. Cease and desist letters flooded inboxes. Statements condemned the leaks as criminal theft and fabricated lies. But the world wasn't listening anymore. Once trust is broken, every denial sounds hollow. Every defense sounds desperate. And so, the couple's words carried no weight. Instead, people turned to the leaks themselves. To the emails, the texts, the receipts. To the raw, unvarnished truth. And the truth was merciless. But before you think this was the end, it wasn't. Because buried in that file, tucked between the frantic messages and contracts, was one final bombshell. A revelation so personal, so intimate, that it made the first 3 leaks look like child's play. And when that revelation surfaced, it didn't just expose a scandal. It threatened to erase everything they had left. If the first leaks exposed violence, and the 6th chapter's archive exposed corruption, the 7th revelation cut deeper than either. It revealed their hearts. Buried within thousands of messages, hidden between legal strategies and PR talking points, was a series of private notes. Not public statements, not staff memos, purely personal. Letters, emails, and even voice recordings. The kind of things never meant to be seen beyond the walls of their relationship. And yet, here they were. At first, they seemed harmless. Casual notes about day-to-day life. Grocery lists, travel plans, reminders. But as journalists combed through the file, something far darker emerged. The notes weren't just logistical. They were emotional. And they told a story the cameras never captured. Her words, sharp and cutting. His words, pleading, uncertain. Again and again, a pattern appeared. He begging for peace, she demanding more. More attention, more validation, more control. Do you ever think about what this is doing to me? One note read, typed late at night from his account. Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing. The reply? Brutal. If you're disappearing, it's because you refuse to stand up. Don't blame me for your weakness. Imagine reading that exchange, raw and unfiltered. Imagine hearing his voice crack in an audio clip as he whispered, I can't keep doing this. Only for her laughter to cut through seconds later. It wasn't just scandal anymore. It was intimacy weaponized. And here's where it gets devastating. Among the files was a draft letter he had never sent, addressed not to her, but to himself. A confession written in secret, never intended for another pair of eyes. I tell the world I'm happy. I smile when they expect it. I defend her when they attack. But in the quiet hours, when no one is watching, I feel like a stranger in my own life. I wonder if love is supposed to feel like this, like walking on glass, like waiting for the next storm. And if this is love, then maybe I'm not built for it. Stop and think about that. Not a tabloid headline. Not a rumor. His own words, spilled in ink. The world gasped. Suddenly, the fight wasn't just about footage or evidence. It was about a soul crying out for help. And that cry made the scandal far more personal, far more haunting than any video ever could. Because videos can be dismissed, angles debated, audio questioned. But a private letter? A secret thought never meant to be read? That's truth, stripped bare. And the public's response was immediate. Sympathy surged for him, fury ignited against her. For many, this was the final confirmation, not just of conflict, but of cruelty. The narrative shifted from scandal to tragedy. But let's pause, because here's the question that hung heavy over everything. Who leaked it? Remember, this wasn't just a fight caught on tape. This was the deepest corner of his mind, which means someone had access to the most private files of his life. If it was an outsider, the breach was terrifying. If it was an insider, the betrayal was unimaginable. But if it was her? If she had released his words herself, either out of recklessness or strategy, then we're staring at a level of cruelty almost impossible to comprehend. That possibility alone sent shockwaves through the public. Suddenly, people weren't just questioning the relationship. They were questioning humanity. Because what kind of love ends like this? But the leak didn't stop with his words. Hers surfaced too, and they were no less haunting. In a string of late-night messages to a confidant, she confessed her own torment. He's not the man I thought he was, she wrote. I feel trapped in his weakness. If I push him, it's because I need him to be stronger. But he crumbles, and then I'm the monster. Maybe I am the monster. That line, maybe I am the monster, spread across the internet like wildfire. Memes, headlines, think pieces. Was it an admission of guilt? A cry for help? Or just the words of someone unraveling under pressure? And so, the intimate revelation turned the narrative upside down once more. For every person who saw her as the villain, There was another who saw her as a victim of her own expectations. For every voice that pitted him, another asked whether his silence had fed the cycle. In other words, the truth was messier than anyone wanted to admit. Because intimacy is messy, love is messy. And when intimacy is dragged into the spotlight, it doesn't look like a fairy tale. It looks like this. Broken, raw, terrifyingly human. But here's the real catastrophe. The letters and messages weren't just revelations. They were ammunition. Every outlet, every critic, every rival cherry-picked lines, ripped them out of context, spun them into weapons. What had once been whispers between two people in the dead of night were now headlines screamed in bold across the globe. And with every headline, the couple sank deeper. He, portrayed as the fragile victim, too weak to escape. She, painted as the ruthless aggressor, incapable of love. Together, they were no longer a power couple. They were a cautionary tale. But here's the part no one saw coming. Tucked at the very end of the archive, in a folder few bothered to open at first, was one last note. A voice recording, short and raw. His voice, trembling, whispering into the void. I don't know how much longer I can do this. If something happens to me, know that I tried. Stop. Read that again. If something happens to me, know that I tried. Those words sent shivers through everyone who heard them. Because they weren't just a confession. They were a warning. And suddenly, the scandal wasn't just about abuse, or betrayal, or intimacy exposed. It was about survival. The question wasn't whether the couple could survive the scandal. It was whether he could survive her. And as whispers of his safety grew louder, the world prepared itself for what came next. Because if the leaks had been bombs, this was the ticking of a time bomb no one could defuse. And when it went off, it would change everything. If something happens to me, know that I tried. Those words echoed like thunder through a storm already raging out of control. They weren't a scream, not a grand declaration. They were quieter, almost resigned. A whisper to no one, or maybe to everyone, left behind like a breadcrumb leading into darkness. And the world listened. Again, and again, and again. That short recording became the most replayed clip of the entire saga. Not the fights, not the arguments, not the brutal exchanges, but that whisper. Because whispers haunt. Whispers linger in your mind long after the noise fades. Was it a cry for help? A suicide note? A coded warning? Or was it something more deliberate? A message recorded in the knowledge that it would one day be discovered? No one could agree, but everyone had an opinion. Supporters rallied around him, demanding answers. Was he safe? Who was protecting him? Where was he now? Theories spiraled. Had he fled the mansion, hidden under the watch of close friends? Or was he still inside, trapped in a gilded cage? Critics turned on her with renewed ferocity. If his words were true, then the story wasn't about scandal anymore. It was about survival. And survival stories don't end with joint press statements or legal threats. They end in intervention or tragedy. But here's the most chilling part. She stayed silent. For the first time since the scandal began, there was no statement, no denial, no carefully staged performance. She vanished from the spotlight. No appearances, no interviews, no comments. Silence, in a story like this, is louder than words. And silence ignites paranoia. The press camped outside the gates of their mansion, cameras trained on every window, every flicker of light, every shadow. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Online, hashtags trended by the hour. Hashtag where is he? Hashtag save him. Hashtag in the silence. But inside was a mystery. And mysteries are dangerous. Let's pause here. Think about how stories like this usually unfold. We expect an answer, a conclusion. We expect to know where he is, what he's doing, whether he's safe. But here, there was nothing. Just that whisper, looping endlessly, leaving the imagination to do the rest. And when the imagination takes over, the truth becomes almost irrelevant. Because perception is more powerful than reality. And perception, by this point, was merciless. To the world, he was a man in danger. To the world, she was the danger. But here's where the story twists again. Days after the recording leaked, a new voice entered the saga. Not his, not hers. A third voice. A former staff member stepped forward, speaking under anonymity at first, then on record. Their claim? That the recording wasn't recent. That it had been made months earlier, long before the first leak ever surfaced. If true, that changed everything. Because it meant the whisper wasn't a reaction to the current scandal. It wasn't a response to the chaos unfolding in real time. It was a window into something older, something deeper, proof that the cracks had existed long before the world saw them. And that revelation, that this wasn't a sudden collapse but a long, slow erosion, made the story even more haunting. Because if he had been whispering about survival months ago, then what had been happening all along? Here's the irony. The staff member's attempt at clarification only made things worse. Instead of calming the storm, it fanned the flames. If the recording was old, then maybe there were more. Maybe dozens of recordings, letters, confessions hidden away, waiting to surface. What else had he whispered? What else had been buried? The demand for answers grew louder. Protesters gathered outside their estate, not just journalists now, but ordinary people holding signs, chanting for transparency, calling for him to be seen, to speak, to prove he was alive and free. It was unprecedented. A private scandal transforming into a public outcry, not just for gossip, but for justice. And through it all, he remained unseen. Every day of silence tightened the knot of fear. Every hour without proof deepened the paranoia. Was he hiding? Was he silenced? Was he even alive? No one knew. And in the absence of truth, theories multiplied. Some believed he had escaped, living quietly in another country, protected by those who had finally intervened. Others swore he was still inside, cut off from the outside world, unable to leave. And the darkest theory? That the recording wasn't just a warning, it was a farewell. Let me ask you, which of those would you believe? The catastrophic part of the whisper wasn't just what it said. It was what it left unsaid. It was the emptiness it created, a void filled with fear, suspicion, and dread. And into that void, a new leak threatened to fall. Because whispers were already spreading, not of another video, not of another letter, but of something far worse. Something physical, something undeniable. Evidence. And when it surfaced, it would not just question survival. It would prove whether he had survived at all. The whisper haunted the world. The silence fueled paranoia. But when whispers and paranoia weren't enough, the story lurched forward with something far heavier. Evidence. Not rumor. Not speculation. Not fragments of recordings or scraps of text. Tangible proof. Something you could see. Something you could measure. Something you could not deny. It began with photographs. At first, they trickled in anonymously, like drops of rain before a storm. Blurry shots, captured at odd angles, showing what appeared to be him. Gaunt, weary, eyes shadowed. In one, he was stepping into a car, collar turned up as though to shield himself. In another, standing on a balcony, his arms crossed tight against his chest. The photos alone would have been enough to reignite the fire. But then came the real bombshell, images of injuries. A bruise beneath the eye, a faint mark along the jaw, a bandage wrapped around his wrist. For weeks, the world had debated whether the footage was real, whether the whispers were exaggerations, whether the letters were authentic. But the photographs? They bypassed debate. They felt undeniable. And with them came the question no one could avoid anymore. Who did this to him? Theories exploded. Some said the injuries matched the footage, proof of a violent pattern. Others argued they could have come from something else, an accident, an unrelated incident twisted into scandal. But the timing was damning. Bruises that aligned perfectly with the leaks. Marks that told their own story, wordlessly but powerfully. Then came the hospital record. An anonymous insider leaked what appeared to be a medical intake form. His name, the date, the details of a late-night visit to a private clinic. The notes listed minor contusions, stress-related fatigue, and symptoms of emotional distress. If the photos were fire, the record was gasoline. Because medical evidence cannot be spun with PR, medical evidence cannot be brushed off as gossip. And suddenly, the narrative shifted yet again. This was no longer a story of scandal or even betrayal. This was a case of harm, a case of survival, a case demanding answers, demanding justice. But here's the cruel irony. Even as the evidence piled up, doubt refused to die. Skeptics argued the documents could be forged, that the photos could be staged, that the so-called insiders leaking information had their own agendas. After all, in a world where perception is power, even evidence can be manipulated. And so the debate raged on. Was this truth finally laid bare, or was it another layer of the performance? But for him, the man at the center, the debate was irrelevant. Evidence or not, his silence was the loudest sound of all. He didn't speak. He didn't appear in public. His only presence was in those photos, those records, those whispers. And the absence of his voice left the world both captivated and horrified. What does it mean when someone disappears into silence, even as the evidence of their pain grows impossible to ignore? Here's where the story turns darker still. Because evidence has consequences. Not just in the court of public opinion, but in actual courts. Authorities, long hesitant to intervene in what seemed like a private scandal, could no longer look away. Reports surfaced of quiet inquiries, of officials reaching out, of investigations beginning behind closed doors. For the first time, the fortress of wealth and power didn't look impenetrable. It looked like a crime scene. And with that shift came fear. Inside the mansion, paranoia reached its breaking point. If bruises were visible, if records were leaking, then the walls were no longer safe. Someone inside was betraying them. Someone inside was documenting everything. Someone inside was feeding the world. Imagine that feeling. Imagine not knowing if the person serving your dinner, the person handling your car, the person sweeping the hallways, was the one secretly recording, secretly leaking, secretly building a case against you. Trust wasn't just gone. It was poisoned. And here's the twist. The more the couple turned inward, the more evidence surfaced outward. As though the walls themselves were bleeding secrets. It wasn't just photographs and medical records anymore. It was receipts, surveillance logs, even financial statements suggesting hush payments to staff who had seen too much. Piece by piece, the puzzle was assembling, not by journalists, not by investigators, but by the anonymous, relentless hand behind the leaks. And that raised the most haunting question yet. What was the end game? Because evidence doesn't appear in a vacuum. Evidence leads somewhere. To exposure. To accountability. To destruction. Was the goal to destroy her? To liberate him? To expose the system that had enabled them both? Or was it all part of something bigger, something we couldn't yet see? The public couldn't decide. But one thing was certain. The evidence had taken the story beyond entertainment. Beyond gossip. Beyond scandal. It was life and death now. And that truth hit hardest in one final, devastating photograph. Leaked late at night, grainy but unmistakable, it showed him standing at the edge of their estate. Alone, shoulders slumped, a suitcase at his feet, his face half-shadowed, half-lit by the glow of a street lamp.